All right, you've got your topic idea for your podcast, but what are you going to talk about each and every episode consistently for your podcast and for your listeners to come back for time and time again? Well, that's what this episode is about, so let's roll the titles. Brand My Podcast. This is a show for podcasters to start your podcast with confidence and elevate your voice to give your listeners a brand they can connect with. Brand My Podcast. G'day and welcome back to Brand My Podcast. I am your host, Frank, as always, and this is episode 5. We're getting right into it. We're not yet at pressing record, but we're getting that confidence, that pre-planning up to make sure that when you do press record, it's as easy as just doing that. So let's get into today's topic. But first, I might say as well that if you're listening to this carefully, you might hear a few little raindrops. It's a bit wet and bleak outside, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see we've got the lights on. It's nice and cozy in here. Let's get into the guts of this episode. So today we're talking about what you are going to talk about each and every episode, be it each day, each week, every second week, each month for your podcast so that you show up consistently for your listeners to come back for time and time again and get that great value out of your podcast. Now, to strip it right back here, we've got to determine what kind of podcast you are offering your listeners. Is it going to be one of two things, a guest podcast, or is it going to be a podcast where it's just you, like mine is here, or with a co-host and it's just the two of you talking, or a couple of top co-hosts of maybe the 3 or 4 of you talking. I know a few podcasts like that and they're amazing. So have that structure in place. If you're going to be doing guest podcasts, these are a few things to keep in mind when going down that route to maintain that consistency. The first would be organization. We want to pre-plan our guests in advance so that way you have an episode, cadence that stays and maintains that consistency. It's a hard thing to do, I got to say, and this is where things like batching episodes can help, but we've got to ensure that we get that consistent stream of guests on our show if it's going to be a guest podcast. I've done this and it's really quite hard to maintain, especially if you do a guest podcast with a co-host. That adds just that extra level of complexity and it's very hard to maintain. And I've seen that with one of my podcasts, Branding Banter. Now, the second thing to consider here is if your guest that you're having on your podcast is relevant to the purpose of your podcast, relevant to the topic of discussion that your listeners are there to listen to. If it's just to have someone on, for shits and giggles just because they are who they are, and it doesn't bring that same level of value or that they're not quite fitting the genre or the topic of what your discussion is about, then it's going to be a bit awkward, a bit weird, and not be, doesn't fit that purpose, as I said at the beginning. We want to ensure that we're giving value to our listeners and consistent value of the same kind. So if it's within the realm, so if it's me as a designer and I brought on other people that are design-related guests, that would make most sense. But if I brought on a plumber, and we're talking about design, and it was because they're the best plumber ever, this is a really weird example, but you see where I'm going with that kind of extreme example. We want to ensure that we have a guest that is appropriate to our podcast, which should be, pretty self-explanatory. The other thing with having a guest on your podcast, if you're a service-based business, is you could use your podcast as an opportunity to break the ice with potential clients or customers, whichever way you want to see them. Bring them on your show. It could be one of those things. If you're a coach, you could bring someone on and coach them with a podcast. Or if you're a designer like myself, I could bring on a client to talk about their business and see what they might need in that experience that they give their customers, that I could, then follow on with that rapport that we've had from a podcast episode of having them on the show so they understand a bit more about me, that I could suggest, hey, have you thought about this with your business? This is something that I could maybe help you with if you're interested in having a chat further about this, and use it as that icebreaker to turn, a cold client into a warm lead. And that's something I've learned from Gary Vee, and it can be very beneficial for your business. So there's 3 key kind of considerations with having a guest podcast. The beauty about having guests is you can have as many people as you want on your podcast. And that way it keeps it going and going and going. On the other hand, if it's just you or you and co-hosts, then it's incumbent on you to bring up and come up with these different kinds of topics. It can be much harder. But what we want to do is a few things. The first thing I would suggest is taking your topic. And then within that topic, I'm guessing that there's going to be some subsections of that, general main points of interest relating to it. So for example, with me, I'm a designer. I mean, from design, you could pick out things like logo design or web design or app design, all these different things in podcast branding, which I'm doing now and offering as a service. So they're your subcategories, your subtopics. Within those subtopics, you want to be able to talk about, let's say, a dozen, or if not more, until the cows come home, topics within that subtopic that you can really break down in minute kind of detail. I think the thing with a lot of us is that we take for granted what we already know. And if we break what we know down into tiny little parts and make that the focus of our conversation, you can go off in tangents and things like that, or add anecdotal stories or experiences that back up those points of learning when you're offering to your listeners to give some context, to give some clarity and understanding and relatability. That's what we want to try and do here. So for me, let's say my topic is design, and then the subtopic for this one particular section could be branding, and then within branding there's logo design. What makes a great logo stand out for customers at a distance? And I could talk about that. I could give examples about McDonald's, how that logo, because it's so simple, is that we can recognize it from several kilometers away. You see what I'm kind of doing there? I could talk about that for a whole episode. The other way you could do it is serialize it based on a big kind of topic. And this really depends on your genre of podcast. But think about things like those murder kind of mystery podcasts. They're like recounts or documentaries in themselves, where they take a big story and then break down each part. So the listener comes back time and time again to find out more details about the overarching story. It's like watching a TV show, you watch a serialized TV show and it presents you one small story each week or each episode at least. In the Netflix days, it's kind of just like binging back to back. But you get what I mean there, I really hope there. But one amazing example which I want to give you, which may or may not give you some inspiration here, is a podcast called Four Finger Discount. That's right, Four Finger Discount. It's a podcast about The Simpsons in that TV show. And each of their episodes is a recap and analysis of each and every episode in their 20 plus, series show. And sorry, that's my Siri going off. I didn't get that. No, you didn't. Try again? Thank you, Siri. So each week, these guys come to the table with a dissection, I guess you'd call it, of each episode. It's amazing just how you can break down something so granular like that and have all that content to talk about. And, they'd get through, one season each year, and that could go for 20 years. So we want to pick a topic that we could obviously talk about till the cows come home. Every single little bit about what you're interested in and what's going to give value to your listeners. Be it entertaining, be it educational, inspirational, whatever it is. This is something that we obviously need to go into a podcast knowing that we can talk about this topic endlessly. So that way we can show up consistently and with purpose for our listeners to want to come back for more and more. But the big point here about consistency is here planning, but then also on the flip side is talking about what it is you know. But there's a little side thing to that, is to say that you can talk about something that you know enough about, but then use the podcast as a learning opportunity. I forever listen to Joe Rogan's podcast, and he might not know anything about epidemiology, but he'll do his research and then he'll have a guest on that's an epidemiologist about talking about COVID. Having that understanding as you have people on your show or you research into the topic that you're talking about to find out more. The other example which I want to give here, which is it's a pretty hard feat to do, is a podcast called Tesla Daily. Now, this is a guy that talks about Tesla, the Tesla cars, the batteries, all that kind of stuff every single day. He shows up for his listeners to talk about anything and everything about this company, Tesla. But what it does show is that you can find a topic that is out there that you can talk about, as I said, to the cows come home. So that's pretty much the end of the show. What I will leave you with, though, is to say that I hope this has given you some confidence and some inspiration to pick what you're going to be talking about each and every episode for your podcast. Write a laundry list of all the things that you could talk about and cover in your podcast. And then for each and every single one of those little subtopic, episodes, is just write a few little bullet points about each one and talk to those bullet points. Then you'll have a podcast to put out there that people will enjoy and come back for more. With that, I'm going to tell you here that if that is all too hard for you, I'm here to help. I have a service called Brand My Podcast. It's the same name as this show. Try to make it as easy as possible for you, where I help podcasters start their podcast and help them along with that. Be it creating your cover art, setting you up on your preferred hosting provider, planning out your episodes, picking your topics, and organizing how you're going to approach guests. If that's something you need, head to brandmypodcast.com and I'd be happy to help you there. But if you want to catch up with me, connect with me on social media, the best place is probably Instagram. So hit up @G'dayFrank there and you can send me a DM. You can follow along with the content that I make in addition to this podcast. And it's all about branding your podcast and starting that podcast with confidence. Hope you get out there and start your podcast today, tomorrow, next week. Start it soon. It's the time to do one. With that, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.